Once upon a time, on the north shore of Long Island, some 30 miles from New York, there lived a small girl on a large estate. The estate was very large indeed, and had many servants. There were gardeners to take care of the gardens, and a tree surgeon on a retainer. There was a boatman to take care of the boats, to put them in the water in the spring, and scrape their bottoms in the winter. There were specialists to take care of the grounds, the outdoor tennis court and the indoor tennis court, the outdoor swimming pool and the indoor swimming pool. And there was a man of no particular title who took care of a small pool in the garden for a goldfish named George.
For a brief moment in time, the Gold Coast of Long Island was the benchmark of elegance and splendor. A golden era of luxury and decadence lived behind their tightly closed gates. These opulent mansions with gilded ceilings, marble pavilions, and immaculate gardens were the ultimate gated communities. Lavish parties were held almost nightly. Prominent families with names such as Vanderbilt, Astor, Chrysler, Morgan, and Tiffany lived a grand life and indulged their every whim while trying to outdo their friends and business rivals. This was high society at its most extravagant. In Sabrina, this privileged enclave was seen through her eyes as a wonderful and hopeful place. But was this dream world just a figment of Sabrina's imagination? Or did this glamorous playground really exist? A vast area of the north shore of Long Island, from Great Neck to Huntington, was a favorite retreat of the rich and famous.
They would build these humongous mansions, and since these were the more affluent families, they called it Gold Coast.
Starting at about the turn of the century and through the 1930s, the North Shore was a virtual who's who of high society. From the Astors to the Vanderbilts, this was the place to be for some of the most powerful and successful Americans.
They hired the best architects and the best engineers, and they hired the best real estate brokers. The wealthiest families in the world, J.P. Morgan, F.W. Woolworth, who founded the Five and Dime stores, the Pratt family, who were Standard Oil with the Rockefellers. The wealthiest families in the world could have gone anywhere they wanted. And they said, find me the most beautiful place in the world that I could live, that's close to Manhattan.
There was a commuter culture from the great estates to Manhattan, but a lot of it was by steam yacht. In fact, in the hot summer days, people, though they lived in these great big estate houses, would sometimes sleep on their steam yachts because it was cooler to sleep in the harbor. There was also a competition between the ferry boat and the harbor where you could commute to New York on that. The wealthy people sometimes did that also. Eventually, the Long Island Railroad bought the ferry service and basically put them out of business.
At the turn of the century, millionaires and tycoons began to build their own architectural masterpieces. Built without financial restrictions, castles, Italian villas, and French chateaux began to sprout up along the coast of Long Island Sound. The formal gardens were landscaped to match the grandeur of the historical manors and luxurious residences of Europe.
It was very much like living in England, you know, the lifestyle, the social customs. They played polo, they played croquet, they had Edwardian tea parties. There was a style that was unique to England, and the prominent families out here adapted that lifestyle because it was so poetic and gracious and beautiful. It was a very common thing in the fall to hear the thundering hooves or the bugle masters blowing the horn and the hounds chasing the foxes, which were prevalent. There are no fox hunts. There are beagles, but there's no foxes left for the beagles to chase. It's a big change.
You had the English country lifestyle was in fact duplicated here by the settlers, many of whom came from those places originally. So it's not unusual to find English country homes, English manor homes. You have all of that here.
These enormous estates were also the epicenter of the social lives of high society. They were a virtual playground for glamorous gatherings and lavish costume balls. Everyone who was anybody gave parties.
They used to have huge parties, and they had a great time, drank a lot of champagne, and dancing and frolicking, and there was no one around because there were all these large estates with many acres, so that they weren't really bothering anybody. so that they could do what they wanted to do and have a good time.
As more wealthy New Yorkers began to build permanent summer homes, a resort community began to emerge. A half-dozen large hotels, boarding houses, rental cottages, oyster bars and saloons were built to serve the casual vacationers, entertainers, and hired help.
Glen Cove specifically began as a settlement called Mosquito Cove in 1668. So it has a history that goes back 300 years. This town has always had a mix of the wealthy and the working class, and even the impoverished in the same community. From the turn of the century to maybe the 1950s, the wealthy was very involved with bringing up the quality of life for the underclass. You had the Pratts and the Morgans, who were the primary benefactors of the city. J.P. Morgan gave the city Morgan Park, which is this amazing park that was dedicated to his wife, Jane Norton Morgan.
My grandfather came to Glen Cove to work, as many Italian immigrants did at the time, and other immigrants, to work on the big estates in the area. Or people like my grandfather, who worked as a houseman, helping to polish the silverware and wax the floors, or other Italian Americans or Irish Americans that worked on the grounds, taking care of the grounds, or other people who worked as butlers or as house cleaners. And now those families are still living in Glen Cove.
In 1953, director Billy Wilder chose the sleepy town of Glen Cove, Long Island, as the location for his romantic comedy, Sabrina.
People in Glen Cove don't see Sabrina as a fictitious Glen Cove. That is their Glen Cove. Glen Cove has this magical power in people's stories. The only place that I can really absolutely identify in the movie is the Glen Cove train station, which still looks virtually identical. And people have actually gone there and sort of posed like Audrey Hepburn and had their snapshot taken there.
Taxi, miss. Cheapest rates in Glen Cove.
Well, hello, how are you?
The Glen Cove train station, which I think goes back to around 1900 or 1890s. I know that railroad station was put in before a lot of the mansions were put in. And I think it's listed as a landmark at this point. They cannot change it. I hope that's the case.
In a testament to modern times, in 1900, it took 1 hour to get from Glen Cove to Manhattan. Now it takes 1 hour and 5 minutes.
Virtually, Glen Cove has remained fairly well untouched since that period of time. The beaches are the same, the water is the same. But DeSource is one of the oldest streets in Glen Cove, and it runs all the way to the water where Morgan Island is. DeSource Lane was a little country road and didn't have that many houses on, but there are still some houses there to this day that you know had to be there in the turn of the century. When you drive down DeSource and you can see nothing but trees and a house way off in the distance, it's like a movie set. It is a movie set. It's like any movie that you've seen where they drive up in the Rolls-Royce town car to the house, and that's the house.
In the 50s, most of the estates were still standing, and there were 600 of them. And most of them had indoor pools, outdoor pools, you know, playhouses, as they were referred to, with squash courts and bowling alleys and rifle ranges, everything to keep the wealthy guests happy. Most of the film was shot in this area at several of the Pratt mansions.
We know it was at a Pratt estate, but what people don't realize, there are several Pratt estates. Someone will swear it was at Harrison House, and someone will swear it was at Salutation where they shot the second one. Other people will say it was absolutely at Woolworth. Nobody really knows. So that's the hard thing. We're still trying to find that one person who actually knows where this was.
Glen Covers are fascinated by the fact that films were shot here. Everybody wants to claim that they know where and they have a part in the films that were shot here. So if you ask somebody, they will tell you Welwyn or Glen Cove Mansion or what have you, but it mostly seems to be hearsay.
These legendary estates were eventually killed by the advent of a federal income tax and the financial losses of the Great Depression. By the early 1960s, hundreds of these magnificent estates stood empty in a state of ruin. Within a few short years, developers overtook the choice land and swept most of them into oblivion. However, the Gold Coast is still spotted with wealth and old-world charm. These regal mansions are now the remnants of a gilded age long past, haunted by fantasies from another time. The transient beauty of these colossal palaces captures the spirit of a lost world that will never come again. And like Sabrina, we will always long for the fairy tale that is just beyond our grasp.